Hello and welcome to the Gardener's World magazine Masterclass on containers. My name is Emma Crawforth and I'm the gardening editor of Gardener's World magazine. And I'm going to introduce some people to you that are going to help me to talk to you about containers today. So we're going to talk to you about how to plant up containers, what to use in your containers, what kind of containers to use, what compost to use, and also talk about why you would use containers rather than simply planting in your garden. I hope you enjoy it. Why would you plant in a container when you could just plant your plants in the ground like these ones behind me in your garden beds? Well, there are lots of really good reasons for choosing to plant in a container instead of straight into the bed. So for example, a container makes the most fantastic focal point in your garden. If you want to make a statement, it's a really good thing to plant up a container, for example, that you could put by your door or at the top of some steps, and that really draws the eye, and it's a great way to get people looking through the garden and focusing on something. So as well as that, there are lots of other reasons. For example, you might want to do it for convenience or to suit a certain plant. In some situations, you don't have any soil, so you have to plant in a pot. For example, on a patio, you just have to use compost and get your plants into that if you're going to grow anything there at all. And again, if you have a flat roof, for example, that you want to plant up, then you're going to need to use containers up there. And that's a really great way to create an oasis in a place that would otherwise be quite barren. So in other situations, it's actually more convenient to plant in pots. I planted these tulips in the autumn, and it was just a lot easier for me at that time of year to put some compost in this pot, to put the bulbs in, probably somewhere around here in this pot, and then to fill up the rest of it with compost and then just leave them growing away over winter, and those are going to flower soon and they'll look really great, and when they come out I can then choose whereabouts in my garden I want to show those flowers off. And then, for example, this blueberry requires ericaceous compost, so that's compost that's quite acidic, and if I tried to plant this in ordinary soil it wouldn't be very happy, but in a container I can put in ericaceous compost and really meet this plant's needs so that it's going to thrive and fruit for me in the summer. Here are some dahlias. Now these are bedding dahlias, they're tender, and it's quite a nice idea to put something like this into a container that you perhaps keep in a coolish greenhouse until the danger of frost has passed, and then you can bring out that container just before it flowers and put it somewhere where these flowers are really going to look great in your garden. But you can't have that in your garden all year round, so bringing it in and out of the greenhouse is a really good way to grow these plants. This plant is a rosemary, and it's actually a prostrate rosemary, so it dangles down rather than growing upwards. And of course a container is a really great situation to show off a plant like this that can just gently hang over the sides of the container, rather than if you put it in the ground it would sort of crawl along the ground and it wouldn't look its best. And here is a saxifrage, which is an alpine plant, and it likes really free draining soil, which is quite easy to provide in a container if you use a bit of gravel in your compost and you use free draining compost. So in some situations, such as clay for example, this wouldn't be happy at all. So if you have clay soil, why not try planting some alpines in a pot with free draining compost? And then finally, another reason for growing in containers is purely experimentation. Here's a sempervivum. It's got a beautiful colour to it. It might possibly change colour a little as it gets more sunshine on it. So if I want to work out how it's actually going to grow before I put it in a more permanent situation, I can just put it in a pot with some gravel that goes nicely with it. So yeah, use them for experimentation, use them for trying things out. And now here's Ashley Edwards.
When selecting your container, make sure it has a drainage hole. This is very important as you don't want your compost to get waterlogged and rot the roots of your plant. The next step is to fill your container with compost. At this stage, You can add in slow release fertilizer pellets, and these will feed your plant for up to 6 months. Firm in the compost to get rid of any air pockets. Next, prepare your plant for planting. Give it a really good soak. Lift it out of its pot. Tease out any of the roots that have become root bound. And you can also divide your plant to produce more and space them apart. Place the plants into your pot. Fill any remaining gaps with more compost and firm in around the roots of your plant. Make sure to leave a watering gap at the top of your container. This will prevent the soil spilling out when you come to water. Once your plants are in, you can give them a water and at the same time clean off the outside of your pot. Now that we've watered our container, we can add a layer of mulch. I'm using gravel. This will help to retain the moisture and also suppress weeds. So we'll just add a thin layer on the surface of the compost. I'm going to give it one more water for good measure. And there you have it, that's the basics for potting up a container.
And now here's Himera Ikram to show us the perfect way to plant up a spring container.
It's spring and the daffodils are up and it's been the longest winter ever. What do you want to do? I want to plant up some spring bulbs in some pots. So the first thing I would do is look for some pots and see that I have a pot that is big enough. This one is about 50 centimetres round, so it'll be able to fit everything that I want to in it. It's also got a hole for drainage, so we don't have to worry about that. The next thing I would do is think about the compost. I have here a peat-free multi-purpose compost, which is really loose and lovely. So we can add that to our pot. Just be generous, it's a deep pot. So once we have our compost in our pot, we want to think about our composition. What are we going to put into this pot? What's going to bring light to our days? So I've got this beautiful hellebore here, which has got pink tones but an eye of yellow. So with that, I might try this tulip here, which is again sort of a lemony tone, but it has a slight rose pink to the base of the flower. With my composition, what I seem to have done is I seem to have got some flow, which is going from the bottom there up to the hellebore and then along to this primula here. So this primula really picks up on the centres of both the tulip and the hellebore, and I think that would work really beautifully there. And then there's another smaller pink primula which would work with this hellebore and would bring the composition down. And then maybe we could end with a trailing variegated ivy, which I have a problem with variegation, but this works really well with this primula and also with the tulips. So that variegation definitely works here, and then that can trail down the front of the pot. Let's start putting the plants into the pot. With the compost, you may have to move it around a little bit because these pots are not the same size. So this one is much bigger, so I'll have to maneuver the compost around to make this fit. And what you want to do is you want to have your plant probably a finger's depth below the side of the edge of the pot, so that when you water it, the water goes into the pot and not over the top. The second thing I'm going to do is add this tulip. There we go. we're going to move on to this primula. Sometimes the plants don't want to come out, sometimes they come out very easily. Just a little short, sharp push, little jerk, usually works that out. Here we go, that looks quite nice, and that's in the right place. Yep, I think stepping back is also always a good thing. Just making sure it all fits together. Now, let's see if we can fit in this little pink primula, or it might be too much. Let's try it. To make things fit, you can take some of the soil away. So I'm just going to take a little bit of this outside of the soil away from this primula, just to make sure that we can make it fit well into the pot. Okay, and I think there is enough space for this little ivy to tuck over the top and hopefully wend its way down the front. Step back and take a look. Tidy up your workstation. And then we need to fill in all the gaps with the extra compost. Make sure that you have all the roots in contact with some compost and there's no air gaps. Once this is all in, I like to tidy up with a little brush, get some of the soil off of the flowers, make sure the leaves are looking lovely and clean. And then once you're happy with all of that, we can water the plants in. You want to water them in really well to give them a good start. And there you go, you're ready to put this by your front door.
I'm going to talk to you now about what to put into your pots. So for every plant you're going to want to have the perfect medium to grow those plants in, and generally that comes down to putting in some compost. Now most of the time you're going to be using compost that's known as multi-purpose compost. So here's some multi-purpose compost. This is largely composed of organic matter, and it's as you can see, it looks quite fibrous. Because basically these particles here, they're made up of generally old plants that have been composted down, and so you get that kind of fibrous texture, which is really good for holding moisture and for looking after your plants well. And there's more than one type of multi-purpose type compost. Some of them you can get that'll say on the bag that they're for vegetables. So they have often more nutrients in them, which is great for when you're growing your summer vegetables, and you want to have lots of nutrients to help those summer vegetables really thrive over that summer period and grow nice and big and strong for you, ready for harvest. And then another type is ericaceous compost, and ericaceous compost will look a bit like this. It's also full of organic matter, but ericaceous compost is good for acid loving plants. It's acidic, and so it's good for camellias, rhododendrons, blueberries, those plants just need that sort of compost in order to thrive, and so look for that on the bag as well. Now, one thing I would say about multi-purpose compost is always go for peat-free compost, because compost with peat in it takes the resource of peat that's been dug up from the ground, and it's a non-renewable resource, so really important to go for a bag that says peat-free on it. And then moving on to this type of compost, this is a soil-based compost. If you look at it, you can see that it's full of these very fine particles, which are actually soil or sand, and it has special properties. So soil is really good at holding on to nutrients. It actually uses something called the cation exchange, which helps it to do that. And that means that it's really good for plants that are going to be in their containers for a long time. So anything you're going to keep in a container, say, for over a year, go for soil-based compost, but that is actually also very heavy because of its big mineral content. And then we also have some gravel here. Gravel you can mix in with your compost when you're planting, and that helps to make your containers more free draining, which is really great for certain plants like, say, alpines or succulents. So that's gravel, and gravel is also great to use as a mulch on top of your pots. It makes them look really great. And then finally perlite, which is a mineral, believe it or not. It's really, really light. Barely weighs anything, these, really bright white, but it's actually an expanded material, expanded because it has lots of air in it, so it's really great for adding good aeration to your compost. You can mix it into your compost, but it also, in those spaces where the air is, will take up water as well, so it can be quite a good way of holding water in the compost too. And then of course, again, you can use this as a mulch if you fancy having something really bright white on top of your pots, rather than a more natural looking gravel mulch, for example. And now I'd like to introduce you to David Hurrian.
Now, pots are a great way to grow a whole range of different fruit, but particularly they're good for growing things like blueberries, which blueberries like acid soil, and not everybody has an acid soil in their garden. So growing in a container means that you can give them that acid compost that they need to grow and thrive. And also growing them in a pot means that you can control the amount of water that they need, because blueberries are quite thirsty plants. Containers are also really good for things like strawberries, again for that watering point of view. They don't need acid compost, but they do need plenty of water when those strawberries are swelling. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, any of these fruit are best grown either in a plastic container or a glazed terracotta container, rather than a porous sided container. And that's because the water tends to stay in these sorts of containers, where it can be wicked away or drawn away by the terracotta sides of a pot like this. But what I'm going to do is pot this blueberry into this size of container to start with, and then ultimately pot it up progressively into a larger and larger pot, and probably end up in a pot something like this size eventually. The reason that we don't pot straight away a pot of this size into a large container is that if we do that, the roots will tend to rush out to the edges of the new larger container, go round and round, and not make efficient use of the compost inside the pot. So what I'm going to do is just proffer this up into this container and see that I can just about get my finger in all the way round. That's big enough, and it means that I can get my finger in just to firm that compost in place. I'm going to start by using this peat-free ericaceous compost to half fill the pot, and then offer the plant in its pot in position just to make sure it's going to sit at around about the right sort of height. That's just about right. If the pot is very dry, if the container is very dry, water it thoroughly before you knock it out of the pot, because it will come out more easily. Pop the plant in place, just about the right sort of level there, and then go around the edges and feed some more of this ericaceous compost in around. Once you've done that, it just remains to jiggle the pot around just to settle it down. Use your fingers just to poke some more down if necessary. So then all it needs is a little bit of water from the watering can. This needs to be rainwater collected from a water butt rather than tap water, which can tend to be very limey. So give this a good soak, and that plant should be ready to grow away. Blueberries really like a place that's got a reasonable amount of sunlight. Doesn't need to be in full sun at midday, otherwise the plant in the container can dry out and can suffer. So probably sunlight for about half the day, a west or an east facing position, so that it does get some shade from that midday sun. So once you've done that, the other thing that's really good to grow in containers are strawberries. And these young plants, you can see they've already got flowers, and those flowers will set fruit. So even young plants like this will soon come into fruit just in a single year. You'd probably get about 4 plants in a trough like this. Remember that these don't need ericaceous compost, so these would be quite happy to grow in just a general purpose compost, a peat-free general purpose compost. I'd sieve some of the big lumps out of this before I potted it up, and I might put a little bit of extra gritty sand in here just to open up the structure, because strawberries don't like to be too waterlogged. And then this container will produce fruit in the first season after planting, and then last for about 2 years before you need to knock everything out and replant with some fresh plants. But a great way to grow some succulent strawberries for this summer.
I've got a few top tips on how to maneuver your summer containers. The first thing is work out where you want it. Where do you want to see it? And put the pot in that position before you start filling it up with plants. Once it's full, it's much harder to move. So just make sure you've positioned it well. The second thing I would say is think about the right plants for the right place. If it's in a hot and sunny, dry place, then make sure that your plant combination works with that situation. The same as if it's in a shadier and cooler place, then think about that as well. If you think about these things before you put your pots down, then you don't have to mollycoddle your plants all year. The third thing I would say is if you do have to move your pots, you could use a pot trolley. And you have pot trolleys like this, which you can put your pot straight onto and leave it on here, and then you can maneuver your pot wherever you want to. I have one with handles, which then you just lean your pot back and then you can put it on and maneuver your pot that way. The other thing that I think is really useful is to use feet. I usually use this for drainage, but on top of that, it just gives you a little bit of space underneath the pot, so it's easier to get onto your trolleys. So that's really a helpful way to make it slightly easier for you. And the final thing is, if you do have to, why would you have to move your pots? So a couple of reasons. Maybe in the summer when you go away for a holiday, you might want to move your pots that are in the sun into the shade so you don't have to water them as much. Or over the winter, you might want to think about moving some of your pots into the greenhouse.
So this plant has been planted up to engage your sense of touch. And in here we have plants such as Dianella, which has this almost spiny ridge on the back, but you can easily run your fingers through it. This plant here, Salvia argenta, has these really hairy leaves, almost like a little bunny's ear. And this Senecio angel wings is also covered with a soft down, which is just so soft to the touch. Running your hands through this convolvulus is really therapeutic. And the pot itself has these ridges which make it very tactile. So all the plants in this planter have a silver tone, but you don't have to use only silver plants. For example, we have this pinkish red phormium here, which would look great against the other plants. So place this planter somewhere in your garden where you can easily reach it and enjoy the therapy of touch.
There are a whole host of different containers that you can grow plants in, from things like troughs and window boxes through hanging baskets, urns of different sorts of shapes and sizes, but also standard pots, and they come in plastic, wood, but also terracotta, and there are glazed terracotta types as well as the unglazed. The key thing with those pots is that you want to make sure that they're frost proof, so that if you're keeping them outside during the winter, that they survive any severe winter frosts. But that whole host of different types of containers, even things like wall mangers and wall baskets, means that you can grow plants in all sorts of different locations in your garden. But whatever container you choose, make sure that it's of a generous size. The smaller the pot or the smaller the basket that you're growing your plants in, the more they'll be reliant on you for all their watering and all their feeding needs, and you'll have to keep maintaining them constantly. And the plants won't really grow healthily in a teeny tiny pot. So choose something that's big enough to accommodate a really good, well-developed root system. So even things like this are fine for their size as you're growing the plants bigger and bigger. But when it comes to permanent planting in pots, choose something as big as this. So this is about 40 to 45 centimetres in diameter and a similar sort of height. Choose something that's big enough so that when that plant is big, it can get its roots down into all that nice moisture and nutrient and grow away really, really healthily.
I just want to talk a little bit about some design tricks that you can use to make sure that your pots look their best, and that's particularly important when you mix up a few different plants together. There's a few simple principles that you can use. For example, make sure that the colours are coordinated. So here we've got this cordyline with its reddish tones. These also heuchera flowers, and they pick up that reddish tone, which also goes with the container that has a sort of rusty brown look to it. And then finally a little pop of colour from these pelargonium flowers as well. That's slightly pinky. So it's not too matchy, but I think all of these three elements go really, really well together, especially with this lovely container. And another thing is that when you use reds, they contrast really well with greens. And so where you have this greenish foliage from this pelargonium and the heuchera here, that all hits off against the red really nicely. And another thing you can talk about is texture. So these leaves are really smooth, long, and they give you a kind of shiny look to the pot, whereas the heuchera leaves are completely matte and almost mottled. And these two sort of hit off against each other really well as well. Now, a really useful principle for planting up pots is what we call thriller, filler, spiller. Easy to remember. So in this case, I'm going to say, this is my thriller. This is the cordyline. It almost gives you an explosion here at the back of the pot. And then you also have filler elements. Now, the fillers are the things that are just there to sort of fill up the space, to provide a really good foil for your thriller. You don't want lots and lots of thrillers because otherwise that's going to be too much. So you need something to contrast them with. And then finally, a spiller element is really helpful. So here we're using a pelargonium as the spiller, and it just tumbles over the top of the pot and softens the rim of the pot there. So that's a really useful way of making sure that your pot looks great. So having a thriller, a filler and a spiller. And then of course always look at proportions. Does my container go well with the proportions of the plants that I'm using with it? Are the plants a little bit small compared to the container, or even too large compared to the container? Here I think they're probably just about right. Another principle is to use things in 1s, 3s and 5s, which always looks more natural than 2s and 4s. So here, for example, one thriller plant, and then we've got 3 of these kind of more bushy elements, the 2 heucheras and the pelargonium here. But also I've tucked in here 3 dahlia plants. So they're ready for when they start sprouting later in the year. They're going to grow a little bit taller and produce some beautiful red flowers. And there are 3 of those because that's going to give it the best look when we have 3 bright red dahlia flowers coming out the top here.
As your plants are in a container, they will rely on you to keep them watered. The rainwater probably won't be enough. So water your containers in the summer every day if it's windy and dry conditions. If you're planning to go away, you can use a self-watering system. This is a fantastic way to recycle your plastic bottles. And these self-watering systems can be filled with water, placed into the pot, and then the water is slowly released into the soil. You can also invest in irrigation systems. This connects to your mains water supply and comes on automatically to water your containers. The saucer is a good old-fashioned method. Just fill it up with water, put your pot into the saucer, and it will draw up the water that it needs. It is important, however, not to let your pot become waterlogged. So By using pot feet, you can raise your pot above the ground, and this will allow the water to drain out through the drainage hole at the base of your container. To feed your plants, you can use a liquid fertilizer. Use this every 2 weeks during the growing period. You can also incorporate pelleted fertilizer into the compost. This will keep your plants fed for up to 6 months. To keep your containers looking good, you'll need to give them a trim. This erigeron is looking a bit scruffy, but we're going to give it a trim, and in a couple of weeks it's going to be looking fantastic. You can also refresh the soil by removing the top few centimeters of the compost. Add a layer of fresh compost that's been incorporated with the slow release fertilizer. Firm it in and then give it a good water. And there you have it, your containers will be looking brilliant for the summer.
Summer's coming. So how do we update our pots to make sure that we get some beautiful displays through those hot summer months? Here's a classic pot done for summer months, and it has a selection of plants in it. So the first one that we're going to look at is here, a pelargonium. This is a tender pelargonium, so you can't have this out all year, and especially in the winter, it won't survive. So you'd have to take this in. But this pink and this texture of this leaf really works well with the next plant along. So you can see that this is a delphinium, which has got a different textured leaf. So even now, without the flowers, which will be tall and white and spire-like, which will really work well against that pelargonium, which is rounder and softer. Even now, without the flowers, you have the textural difference of the leaves, which works really well. Also, the colour of these is a bright yellow, as opposed to a slightly glaucous and furry grey. Then we move around the pot, and we have our trailing ivy. Again, it's bringing your eye down and across the pot as well. So in the summer, you'll have this spire up here, as well as something coming lower down as well. Then you come back from that and you have this lovely rose. It's a David Austin rose and it's a single. And the reason that this has been put in is because the pelargoniums are not particularly good for pollinators, whereas David Austin single roses are particularly good. So we've kind of put a mix of plants in here to not just look beautiful, but to be really good for the ecosystem and beneficial insects as well. And then as we come back round to the other side, you come back down using the ivy, which then pulls your eye back round again to the front. Now we've talked about our classic summer container, how could we improve it or change it for the next year? So with this lovely pelargonium, it's a very pink pelargonium, maybe we could switch it for something with a little bit more drama and add something like this deep red one. And then we could also have a rose to amplify this colour. You also get bicolour ones, which would work quite well too. As we work around here, this delphinium with its lovely textural leaf, we could switch that maybe for a lupin, which would do the same kind of job. So you would still have those tall spires, but slightly different. And also you can see with the textural difference between this and the pelargonium would also be really lovely without anything being in flower. And as we work around with the ivy, again, we could go for something with a variegation. That also picks up on the yellow tones of this, maybe some of the brighter greens on the rose as well, and maybe would lighten up this whole corner at the bottom. And some other options could be, so at the moment we've got a composition which is kind of a mound to something tall and then something larger here. Maybe we could switch out our tall spires for something like an achillea, which would have soft plates. So you'd go from some mounds here to soft plates, then to your roses. This again is a perennial, so is the delphinium and the lupin, so you could take these out of the pots and put them into your garden for next year. Whereas with all the pelargoniums, these ones are all tender, so you'd have to take them out of this pot and maybe look after them in your house or in a greenhouse over winter.
Plants in pots are just as likely to be attacked by pests as any other plants, so it's worth keeping an eye out. Watch out for those pests, work out what you've got, and then take control measures to make sure that they don't destroy the plants that you've carefully put into those containers. One type of control that's fairly new to the market is nematodes, and this is a form of biocontrol, which basically means one type of biology being used to control another type of biology. And what you do with nematodes is you simply buy the packet, you keep it in your fridge until you're ready to use it, because it's a live product and that keeps it at just the right temperature, and then you put it into the watering can, stir it around to make a solution, and you simply water it onto the compost or soil where those pests are active. So this is actually really useful for vine weevils and slugs. And that's very relevant to containers because vine weevils are a particular pest in containers, and of course, you know, most plants are not likely to be free from predation of slugs. And then there's another method of slug control which you're probably already aware of, also controls snails, which is these slug control pellets. These ones are organic ones, so less likely to harm other forms of life in your garden. And you simply place those on top of the pot. Don't use too many of these because first of all it's unnecessary, and secondly you're more likely to harm more wildlife if you use them excessively. And then of course squirrels, which are a particular problem in my garden. As soon as I plant up my tulip bulbs, they go for my tulip bulbs. If I didn't use wire to stop them getting in the top of the pots, then they'd be straight in there taking out the bulbs ready to eat. So all I do is I get a bit of chicken wire and I bend it over the top of the pot, squeeze it firmly together so that they can't get it off, and that protects my tulip bulbs all winter. And you can use this method against birds of course as well, keeping birds off, for example brassicas that they like to eat, pigeons for example. So a few simple methods of pest control, and of course just keep those in mind and keep a watch out for anything that might be eating your plants.
Now, summer crops in pots are really fairly straightforward to grow, and you can grow those in quite small containers. So for example, you could just buy some lettuce plants, some young lettuce plants or young beetroot or young salad leaves like these trays here, and just simply pop them up into some standard multi-purpose compost, peat-free compost, into a window box like this, or into a standard flower pot, and crop those plants from those baby plants, growing them on, keeping them well watered. And the season to do that really extends from around about the end of March through April, and then on perhaps till September, even October time, depending on the season. These plants will grow really quickly and you can harvest them quickly and enjoy them in a single season. But you could also fill a large terracotta pot like this one with compost, sieved multi-purpose compost. Just fill that right to the rim. Lightly firm it, don't push your fingers into it, keep it nice and light and open, and then just buy packets of seed and sow those direct into little drills into the surface of that compost. Keep them well watered and they'll grow. It's a really cheap way of growing crops in pots from packets of seed. But the thing that I really like doing is growing herbs in pots, and I love growing them in these unglazed terracotta pots, because the good thing about that is that it wicks the excess moisture away from the plants so that they never get too waterlogged, because most herbs really like dry growing conditions to do really well and to get the best flavour. So things like thymes are really good to grow in this method, chives, and also mint is great in a pot because you can keep it under control. But I'm going to make a layer cake herb container by using herb pots of different sizes layered up rather like Russian dolls, to give each of the different herbs in each layer the ideal growing conditions for them to be happy. So the first thing to do is take the largest pot, and this is a really good gauge of terracotta pot, nice and thick and robust. It's going to stay nice and stable at the bottom here, and then I'm going to fill it with some peat-free multi-purpose compost, just breaking down the worst of the lumps, lightly firming it in position as I go. This is probably a good idea to pass this through a sieve before you fill the pot, but it's still worth consolidating it, just lightly firming it as you go. So I've probably almost 2/3 filled that base level container with my compost, and then I'm going to set my next container in position and firm it lightly so that I make sure it's nice and stable, and that's going to be my next layer. And then before I plant this one up or fill this one, I'm going to plant around the outside, and I'm going to use this mint around the outside. Soak your mint before you knock it out of the pot to make sure that it comes apart nicely, and then tease the individual plants, tease the compost away from the roots and flatten that root ball as you go. So I'm flattening the root ball so that it will actually fit in the space between one pot and the other, and then I'm just going to insert that in place, push the pot against the side like that, and I'm ready for my next mint plant. So same procedure. These are different types of mint. It's rather nice to grow different types of mint so you get different flavours. They won't tend to last in this pot for very long, probably only a couple of 3 seasons before they run out of energy and run out of steam. And you'll also find that the different mints, when their roots come into contact with one another, they take on some of the character of the other mint. So in the long term, it's best to grow your mint separately. But in this sort of context, for a couple of seasons, it's fine. So I've got 2 of my mints in place. My third one is just going to go in here, around this side. Again, flattening that root ball down. This one's quite a beefy one, so I'm going to rip that apart a little bit. And that means that we can get those flattened root balls in that pot all the way around. If you need to take the inner pot out just to get the herb in position, that's fine. And then force the pot back in place. If you need to add a little bit more compost underneath that pot, just to support it, and then we can firm that one in place. And with that one in place, it's then just a matter of building up the remaining layers using herbs that like slightly drier conditions. So there you go, with our thyme in the top pot, chives in the middle pot that like slightly drier conditions, and then our mint in the bottom that likes it wet. We've got the ideal herb pot to keep picking out all the way through the year.
So a few things I think about to stay safe in the garden are, firstly, my back. Always bend your knees when you're picking things up, and just be really careful when you've got pots or heavy things, because it's really easy to start picking those up. And use a trolley if you have one, or just invite some friends around to help you out. The second thing is bulbs and plants. Some bulbs and plants can be irritants to people, and some can irritate more than others. So just have really good hygiene. Wash your hands after touching any bulbs and plants, and just make sure that everything is, clean. Something you may not have thought about is compost dust. So I have this really lovely moist compost here. If it gets dry, you can get some particulates off this, which may affect your respiratory tract. So just be careful of that, and we all have masks these days, so if you have any issues with that, maybe wear a mask. So the final thing I like to do is look after my hands and my feet. So I always wear gloves when I'm gardening, just to make sure I don't get any cuts. And with my feet, I would try not to wear open-toe shoes. I always wear sturdy shoes, and me in particular, I love wearing steel toes just to make sure that if anything falls on my feet, they will be very, very safe.
So today we're planting a scented container. I filled up the pot halfway with peat-free compost, and the first thing to do is put in this metal obelisk for our scented climber, this Clematis armandii. So I'm just going to place the obelisk into the pot and then remove this clematis from its pot. Tease the roots slightly to encourage root growth. Place it in the pot and then feed it in. Next we're going to go with this French lavender, which has scented foliage and flowers and is fantastic for pollinators such as bees. The next plant is this jasmine, and this is going to spill over the edge. The flowers of this jasmine are strongly scented in the evening. And to fill out the rest of the pot we have these Narcissi bridal crown, again very strongly scented and will attract early pollinators. Oops. So now that all the plants are in position, we need to fill in the gaps with more compost. Here I've got some glass beads for an extra bit of dazzle, so I'm just going to put these on the surface now. Spread them around nicely. And the final stage is to water your pot. And there you have it, your scented planter. So here we have a selection of containers that have been planted with plants to produce sound. And sound can add a whole nother layer to the garden. It can be very therapeutic. And plants such as this bamboo, in the slightest breeze, will produce a rustling. And the same goes for this Nandina domestica, also known as sacred bamboo. This will also produce a rustling sound in the wind. This Pyrrhus has these small lantern-like flowers. And when rubbed, they produce a kind of squeaky sound. Why not play with other things in the garden, such as water? We have these sound bowls here, and by pouring water into them, you can create very soothing noises. It's not only the plants that produce sound. Why not experiment with gravel on the top of your pots? You can make your own mini Zen garden. By engaging senses other than sight, we can create a mindful and therapeutic garden experience.
Almost any plant will be happy in a container as long as you give it the things that it needs. And so you need to get to know your plants and what they want. So one thing to do if you're going to buy a plant perhaps is to research it beforehand and find out what compost it's going to need and get that at the same time. So to start with, trees and shrubs. No reason at all why you shouldn't plant trees and shrubs in pots just like anything else. But because they're going to be staying in those pots for a long time, you do need to make sure that you give them a really good quality compost, and I would recommend a soil-based compost to give them the provision that it needs over the years with that soil. And bulbs are great in pots. One thing that you need to do, of course, is to make sure you plant them at the recommended level for that type of bulb. You can also do lasagna planting with bulbs, where you put several different plants, different bulbs in the same pot at different levels, and then they can flower at different times and make use of that pot, perhaps a bit more use than you would if you just had one single type of bulb in there. Hardy perennials are great in pots just as they are in beds. Now, they will die down over winter. So they make a great summer display. Often will go on looking good from spring right the way through until the end of autumn before the foliage dies down. But they're really good value for pots. But just remember that you're not going to have anything showing during the winter, so you might want to either put that pot out of the way or perhaps have it in a part of the garden that you don't visit so much during the winter time. Bedding is often the real star of a pot. This is a little dahlia that's going to grow up much bigger than this and be a real showstopper when it flowers. But of course it's easy to put bedding in pot, but often it's not terribly hardy. If you use summer bedding, it's unlikely to be hardy, so that's just something that's going to look good for the summer and be a quick hit during that time. There is of course winter bedding as well, so things like primulas and violas that you can use to make your pots look great throughout the winter months. And alpines, they're fantastic in pots. You will remember seeing perhaps an alpine trough where you have a gravel mulch across the top and then these beautiful little gems of plants that poke through that gravel mulch and look fantastic. What they need is free draining compost so that they can really thrive. And free draining compost also is needed by succulents. So here's a sempervivum which loves that sort of condition and it will do absolutely superbly in a pot. They do get a bit attacked by vine weevils sometimes, so keep an eye out for those little notches on the leaves that will show if that's happened. And then finally, houseplants. Well, why not plant up a nice container full of different houseplants for your house? And you can go for almost anything. You know, we're used to seeing those in containers, but again, find out what they need and make sure that you give them the right compost and the right amount of moisture for what they like. And of course, seeds, don't forget, you can sow seeds straight into a pot. Just make sure that you've prepared the surface of the compost ready and then scatter them or poke them into the top of the compost.
I love topiarised forms, but we all know how much these can cost. How do we put these into pots and look after them all year round, year after year? So we've got this beautiful wooden planter here and we have a plastic insert which comes with it. With this plastic insert, we need to cut some drainage holes. So I'm just going to cut a few drainage holes. And then we need to put this back into the planter and fill it up with compost. I'm just going to ask my assistant Emma to come and help me with this. Thank you, Emma. Okay. Just going to talk about this compost really quickly. This is a soil-based compost. So unlike the other ones that you can buy, which are peat-free or whatever else, this is a soil-based compost. The reason we've gone for a soil-based compost is because we want this plant to be able to access all the nutrients in here year after year for the whole year. And this has a much better structure than the ones without any soil in. Once we've got the soil in the bottom of the planter, we're going to move this into the planter. Let's see. Okay, that's actually really good height. You can see that there's a bit of space between the bottom of the plant and the actual planter. The soil level is about right. It's just below the edge of the plastic bag. What we need to do now is fill up around this plant. You may need somebody on the other side of the plant to tell you whether it's straight. As we fill around this, you must make sure that the plastic bag is up against the side of the actual pot so it doesn't turn over. It might be really useful to staple that into place. Once you've filled around your plant and the soil level, the compost level is the same level as it was in the original pot, then what you can do is you can get some gravel and dress the top of the pot. This is for three reasons. The first one is to stop any weeds getting in there. Second one is just for it to look really nice. And the third one is once you water it, the water will stay inside the pot rather than evaporating out.
In winter time, you might want to take a little bit of care of your planted up containers to make sure that they make it through the colder months and into spring. So one thing you might want to do is move them to a more sheltered spot. You might, for example, move them into an unheated greenhouse just to protect them from frost, or perhaps even just to a sheltered corner beside a shed that will just keep them that little bit warmer than they would be if they were in a more exposed position. But there are other things that you can do. So one thing that often kills plants in winters is getting too wet. And by raising up your pot onto pot feet like this, you can just make sure that your pot's not in contact with the ground, with moisture soaking up from the ground and keeping that wet condition. So when it's on pot feet, it's going to drain a lot more easily through the hole that's in the base of the pot. And another thing that you can do, of course, is wrap your plants in fleece, horticultural fleece like this. And one thing to do is not just wrap the plant, but by wrapping a pot, you keep the roots of the plant warm as well as keeping the top of the plant warm. So just 3 simple things to do to make sure that your containers survive the winter months.
Now, the most important thing as far as I'm concerned with most of my activities in gardening is that I want them to be sustainable and for the plants to have a use going forward, for the pots to be reusable and for the compost to be able to be put into the garden where it can be recycled in so many ways. And the great thing for me growing plants in containers is that I tend to use my pots as nursery beds, as it were. So I'll plant something small in a pot and grow it on for a few seasons, perhaps using it like these herbs in these containers until they outgrow their pots, and then I can depot the whole thing and plant these out into the garden where they can grow on and get bigger. It's also worth bearing in mind that ultimately plants growing in containers will exhaust that compost, particularly in these sort of size of containers, after just 1 or 2 seasons. So you may have to repot the whole thing, pot them into larger pots, and then that old compost, once it's become exhausted, can be put onto borders and used as a mulch. But ultimately, reusing the plants, reusing the compost and buying sustainable containers will make sure that you're as green with your container gardening as it's possible to be.